Good morning, all. I think we'll kick this off now. My name is Stuart Upton, the interim head of the Widening Participation Unit. So welcome to all to our community forum. We're going to start with an acknowledgement of country.
Welcome. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of Macquarie University land, the Wadamadigal clan of the Darug Nation, whose cultures and customs have nurtured this land since the Dreamtime. We pay our respects to elders past, present and future. We welcome people of all nations and all faiths. Kwai Bidja, Jamna Payala Janawi. Come here, we speak together. We have 60,000 years of archaeological evidence of Aboriginal habitation at Lake Mungo and 20,000 years in Ryde. We have great antiquity. Today, hundreds of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people graduate from Macquarie University. The Darug Nation had famous leaders such as Chief Yarramundi, Naraginji, Colby and Maria Locke. Many of the descendants of these Darug people live today amongst you. We celebrate with you our ongoing attachment and custodianship of this country. We celebrate the achievements of Macquarie University.
So I'd just like to add my own acknowledgement of that. I'm sure we're on lots of different lands here, but acknowledging elders past, present and emerging wherever we are. This forum was previously run as the HEPPP Lunch and Learn until, of course, last year into this. We've been online last year and this year, but hopefully, I'm hoping that our very next one that we'll be able to have it as on campus. It'd be great if we could have that a little bit back to normal. Last year, we had two online versions of the community forums. In November, we had our Allied Network for Enhanced Equity, Relationships with Australia came, Reading Clinic, Campus Life, and then many of you attended then as well. In the June meeting, we had some people from the Smith family who will be joining us again today. Today, our focus is on regional, rural, and remote learning journeys. We have changed some of the funding through the government funding of HEPPP. Supporting the forum today. The HEPPP funding has changed this year, as many of you are aware. So it will actually be looking at the rural regional areas as well as low SES. So that's going to be our focus for today. And that's based on the changes to the government funding are based on the NAPFIN review in 2019. It's obviously an issue for regional remote students in terms of their attainment. Only 16% of those from remote areas actually were able to get bachelor level or above, compared to 18% for outer regional, 20% for regional, inner regional, and then a whole 40% for those from major cities. So you can see it's a major difference in terms of the chances, the opportunities that students from those areas have. And it's not only that they're less likely to start university, they have higher levels of attrition. There are many challenges of distance, and I'm sure many of our speakers today will comment on those, but obviously there's the need to move away, there's financial stress, there's emotional and social challenges as well. And that's something that our team have been working with students from that area, and we'll continue to work with those areas and try and expand what we do. So today we have Sean Brawley, our PVC Program for Pathways, who will talk first. Wendy Field from the Smith family, Peter Davis from the Robert Menzies College associated with Macquarie. We also have the launch of the MyTown Learning Journeys, which is a student-led project facilitated by our Widening participation team. So just to start with Sean Brawley, Pro Vice Chancellor of Programs and Pathways. He leads our portfolio and has been instrumental in much of what has happened in the last year to ensure the university can deliver for students in such a challenging environment. So over to you, Sean.
Thanks, Stuart, and good afternoon, colleagues. Certainly delighted to be here to welcome you to our latest HEPPP community event with this focus on regional, rural and remote learning journeys. And it's probably certainly true that remoteness has a different meaning this week for many of our friends and families, especially those around the Hawkesbury and the Mid-North Coast and elsewhere. My partner and I often visit some friends who have a place on the Hawkesbury, sort of down towards, well, it's tidal. It's that far down towards Broken Bay, but they've witnessed enormous images and been taking a lot of photos and sharing them. They've been counting the number of fridges, actually, that have been making a break, it would seem, for freedom. They're up to 54 this morning. 54 fridges have floated by their house. I don't know, I guess the buoyancy of fridges plays a part. But one of the most tragic photos they sent us was of a house just floating past down the Hawkesbury that still had its windows in, still had the curtains in the windows. Really just extraordinary. And our thoughts are also with our WP friends, Penny and Jeff. WP has had a number of retreats at Penny and Jeff's property at Upper McDonald, which is just past Wiseman's Ferry. Happy to report that they're safe, but it looks like they'll be spending some time in each other's company alone for at least a week to come as the floodwaters recede. I do hope with the recent news from the Premier that we will soon be able to think about a HEPPP Community Forum in person again as we start to transition to a COVID low risk environment. And certainly I think we'll all welcome that opportunity for community in a face-to-face environment. And again, it's still quite remarkable, the journey that we've all faced in the last year, just over a year. So again, we began 2020 in WP with a focus really on how WP might assist communities impacted by the bushfires. And so we rose to the challenge with some other colleagues around the campus, and our now famous Leapmobile, the ex-ambulance, was seen in a number of locations, especially on the South Coast, where we assisted fire impacted communities at that time through colleagues in psychology and other support areas of the university. I am delighted that we will be returning actually to the South Coast this year as the South Coast becomes part of our roadshow initiative, and Jacinta's doing some great work there. A South Coast child of the South Coast as well, so we've got someone in a great position there who understands those communities, and I think probably has a great understanding of the difficulties that on the South Coast, as the South Coast now is also dealing not only with the legacy of bushfires and COVID, but also some flooding events as well. And of course, we then, we spent most of our year trying to think about ways of delivering widening participation through a COVID environment. That was an enormous challenge. And again, I acknowledge the creativity of the WP team. We still managed to engage and interact with students, mostly through Zoom-based events. Although at the end of last year, we did actually manage a COVID-safe roadshow to Broken Hill. And it was great to be back in that community and just really see and sense how strong the relationships are we're starting to build with these communities. And of course, one of our pioneer communities was the Mid-North Coast and that Taree, Port Macquarie area. So our thoughts and prayers are with our friends in those areas, and we hope to get back there again soon. So I'd just like to add to Stuart's welcome to our guests, so to Wendy, to Jessie, to Bridie, and to Peter. Thanks for making your time available and sharing your wisdom and experience with us today. So my job now really is to introduce our first speaker. So you might recall last year, Roberto Grimeld from the Smith family gave an address to us about education in a time of COVID. It was obviously very pointed at that time. And that opportunity really spoke to our relationships with the Smith family, which now are stretching back a number of years. We've really been nurturing this relationship over a number of years. And we've also, in more recent years, finalised a new arrangement in late 2019, early 2020, that really brought that the connection between the Smith family and Macquarie students to a new playing field. And last year we had 20, the Smith family supporting through this partnership with MQ, 20 of our students. And most pleasingly, and I guess speaking in part to some of the topics that Roberta and Roberta spoke of last year and Wendy will speak of today, we enjoyed a 100% success rate amongst those students in terms of graduations, which again, I think just speaks volumes to the importance of these levels of support. And again, our levels of support are modest, but it does show that they can have significant impact. So I do want to now introduce Wendy Field, who's the Head of Policy and Programs with the Smith family. You may have heard Wendy speaking in recent times. She's been a bit of a media personality. I heard her on Radio National, speaking about poverty and difficulties around opportunity for further education. And so Wendy's going to share her experience and expertise, and I thank her very much for making the time. And Wendy, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that introduction, and autographs are available later on request. I'm really delighted to be able to participate in this forum today and really to share the experience of the Smith family and, most importantly, to the voices of the students that we support in regional, rural and remote areas. So consistent with the brief I was given, you can move the slide forward, Sophia. I'm going to talk a bit about the Smith family and our work in regional, rural and remote communities, and what we know about factors influencing or challenging or limiting students from RRR communities to be able to participate in educational opportunities, and the COVID-19 impact. So a little bit about what we heard immediately from our families and what we now understand about the ongoing impacts. Before I kick in though, I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the various lands that we're meeting on. I'm on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation here in central Sydney. I pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge the ongoing connection of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to these beautiful lands and waters. Also just acknowledging the pictures of houses floating by, that really stark image. And we are very conscious that some of the families that we support have now been through bushfires, COVID and floods. And so we're in the process of touching base with them to see what additional support they might need from us, particularly focused on their children's education. So next slide, Sophia, thanks. So I won't go into a lot of detail, but that sort of sets out the Smith family. We've been around since 1922, and we moved from being a welfare-focused organisation, sort of supporting emergency relief, to being very focused on education as a key enabler of changing young people's life circumstances. That was based around us seeing intergenerational requests for welfare and feeling like we were supporting the problem rather than changing the outcome. So about 30 years ago, the Smith family shifted its focus to having a really strong focus on education. Thanks, Sophia. Next slide. I don't need to tell this group that young people who grow up in disadvantaged circumstances are behind at every stage of schooling. So they start school behind, they're more advantaged peers, and that gap actually grows across schooling. So by the time students get to about age 15, there can be a 3-year gap between students who've grown up in disadvantaged communities and their more advantaged peers. And that's actually exacerbated for children who are growing up, particularly in remote communities, as you well know. Thanks, Sophia. This is just a snapshot of the, it's now 57,000 students nationally that we support through our Learning for Life program. So it's in 90 communities across all states and territories, half in regional communities, and 32 of those are in New South Wales. The threshold for participation in Learning for Life is that you have a low income, a healthcare card or a pension concession card. and that you, at the time that you sign up to participate in our scholarship, that parents have a commitment to supporting their children to attend school. That obviously changes. All of the families that we work with have really high risk factors around underachievement for their children in education. So 1 in 5 of our families are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, 1 in 4 in New South Wales. A really strong correlation with health and disability issues. And, you know, it's not a causal relationship, but it's a major factor in being able to participate in education. 3/4 of our parents are not in the labour force or unemployed. Over half are single parents. We have a 6% that we know of in foster arrangements, and our students are highly mobile. We've looked at the relative disadvantage of our students to their peers in below ICSEA schools, and they're more educationally at risk than their peers in those schools. And just demonstrating the duration of the programme, over half of our secondary and tertiary students have been on the programme for more than 6 years. So it's long-term support. To Sean's point, our partnership with Macquarie University has been continuous since 2013. And we continue, I think, to go from strength to strength and work to the benefit of the students who are in Macquarie University, but also the pipeline of students who are in, who could be participants in Macquarie University in the future. And just noting there, of the 140 students who applied for tertiary scholarship this year, 20 listed Macquarie University in their first 3 preference destinations for study in 2021. And I think that's a testament to the work that you do to facilitate ease of access for students from disadvantaged backgrounds and from rural, regional and remote backgrounds. Thanks, Sophia. Just a bit of our footprint in regional, rural and remote footprint in New South Wales. So 65% of all Learning for Life students in New South Wales live in regional or non-metro or non-outer metro locations. 34% of these students identify as of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander background. 15% of our total national cohort of tertiary students of 1,400 come from regional, rural and remote areas, and 26 of our 32 locations in New South Wales are non-metro. So it just gives you a snapshot of the footprint. So I think I, don't need to tell this group that the educational inequality between regional and non-regional Australia is stark. I'm sure that you've seen the trends identified by Emeritus Professor John Halsey in his report prepared for the Commonwealth Department of Education's independent review into regional, rural and remote education in April 2018. And I think the tricky bit really is that there are relatively small differences between the proportion of children who are developmentally on track when they start school based on their geographic location, obviously except for very remote communities. But by year 7, you can start to see the differences in national NAPLAN performance between provincial and metropolitan students, and a gap of about 20% between metropolitan and remote students. So you can start to see the differences emerging in the NAPLAN data. And by age 19, you probably know again that there's a 14.3% difference in year 12 completion between those living in major cities and those in inner regional areas, with the gap increasing again with remoteness. And obviously concerning gaps in participation in university and vocational education training for people living in regional areas. I won't go into the data because I'm sure you're all very well aware of it. We have spoken to our students. We were preparing a submission for the Commonwealth inquiry. We spoke to our students and to some of our partner schools about what they saw as the challenges, and we've set them out there, probably no surprises. The role of digital, I think, is an interesting one, both in terms of its capacity to be an includer for students, if we can overcome the challenge of digital exclusion. The Australian Digital Inclusion Index shows substantial differences between rural and urban areas. In 2017, digital inclusion is 7.9 points higher in capital cities than in country areas. And that's closing, but it's closing very slowly. Things like, in smaller schools, comparatively limited curriculum and weaker connection to post-school pathways, more limited networks and resources, difficulties in attracting and retaining teaching staff. So that's something I'm sure that you're all aware of, but just calling out the challenges for regional, rural and remote Australia. So the Smith family's approach to addressing this is our Learning for Life program. So we aim to give kids from disadvantaged backgrounds, including kids in regional, rural and remote areas, the best chance of building a better future for themselves through our Learning for Life program. And that's got 3 key components that support disadvantaged students. Financial assistance from a sponsor, so a one-on-one sponsor, to help families to afford education costs, such as uniforms, books, and excursions. And then a family partnership coordinator, so support from a family partnership coordinator who supports the students' education journey and connects them and their families to local supports and learning opportunities. It's really a brokering role, so recognizing that for disadvantaged families, there will be obstacles to their children's participation in education across their education journey, and being the link in the service system to enable them to access the support that they need at the point at which they need it. And quite often that's being a bridge back to the school, or it can be connecting them to one of the programs that we run, so educational programs from early years to the tertiary level, or to other learning supports that they might need, or indeed in the later years of schooling to networks and resources that might be beneficial to them through employment exposure programs or mentoring programs. So giving them, I suppose, a view of the possibilities beyond their current community or beyond their current sort of family focus. The programs, next slide, thanks, Sophia. The programs that we run, as I said, run across the scope of a young person's schooling. And the areas that we focus on are really scaffolding literacy and numeracy, be outside schools, so not trying to replicate the work that's done in schools. And then a focus on digital access and digital literacy, financial capability building, and career pathways exposure. And that cuts across the primary years through to tertiary schooling. And specifically, next slide, Sophia, in remote communities, our offering is the Indigenous Youth Leadership Program, which is supporting about 250 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students from remote communities to participate in private schools. So the federal government will provide up to $19,000 a year to support Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students to attend private schools, so places like Joey's, Ascom, a whole range of schools that we partner with. Our role in that is broker for the schools, screening the students and then providing the backup support for students and keeping the connection between the student and their family in remote communities. So that's a little bit of an overview of what we do. And then, of course, COVID-19 hit. And I think the main thing I'd like to say about COVID-19 and its onset from our perspective is that it really brought into sharp relief and in some instances exacerbated the inequities that already existed in our education system. So in some ways, you know, the need for children to be schooled at home had a whole range of impacts. We were immediately inundated with contact from our Learning for Life families who were concerned about a whole range of things. And this was families living in regional communities, but also families in urban. So what I'm about to talk about now is more general feedback from our Learning for Life families, but you can take it as read that the infrastructure and network of services that existed in metropolitan communities was better than it was in regional and rural communities. So next slide, thanks Sophia. So just grouped the most common needs and challenges that we heard in relation to COVID-19, and I'll talk through these in a little bit more detail. So digital support, family support, financial support, and access to educational programs and tools. Families were really immediately concerned about their children's capacity to participate in online learning. And schools, I think at the time that home learning was brought in were really unprepared to be able to support students. I remember walking in on about the third day of school closed down, and I was listening to an expert online talking about how you create the perfect home learning environment for your child. So make sure that they've got their computer set up in a quiet space and that they've got a schedule for the day, and that you could make sure that they've got a whiteboard on which you've written what their sequence is going to be for the day. And for the families that we're supporting, if you had a space at the end of the kitchen table and you might have a computer that's shared between your 5 kids, that was the reality of day 3 of homeschooling. So we've been on a sort of banging on about digital as the possible, next frontier in educational exclusion for some time. And we've been trying to, I suppose, create a patchwork of support through the provision of digital access packs. And we were able across COVID to target an additional about 1,000 digital access packs to specific students, so those who were at most at risk during COVID. But it was a really critical piece of the puzzle that took a long time to be resolved and continues to be a challenge for disadvantaged families, and particularly, again, those in disadvantaged areas. So an example is one mum in Tasmania who is telling us that she'd secured some on-call casual work at an aged care facility, but she was committed to home educating her son. They didn't have any data until a neighbour shared their Wi-Fi. Her son had no device to work on. Mum's not tech savvy and will rely on her phone and her neighbours to get by. So they were the sort of challenges that families were dealing with. So you can move on to the next slide. We undertook a bit of a national survey to understand what our needs were. We got some funding from some of our partners for digital inclusion packs. And as I said, we were able to distribute more than 1,000 packs, but we're really clear that it's not a long-term solution. And if, in my view, if digital exclusion is not addressed, it does threaten to be the new frontier in educational inequality. So while we work on practical solutions, we also work with sector partners on an advocacy agenda around digital inclusion. Thanks. The next bit. The other thing that really kicked in during COVID was the need for support in the chaos. So our family partnership coordinators were there on the ground in every community, and we upped the level of contact that we had with our families, connecting with them to manage stress points, often brought about by misinformation, too much information, information in the wrong language, uncertainty, frustrations, lack of digital ability, parents who aren't confident in their own capacity to support their children. And we were really focused on getting them the support that they need and reassuring them around the fact that schools would come in behind soon and that they didn't need to step into the role of teachers. Thanks. I think we were scrambled to look at what we could do, and the first thing that we did was to try and provide a contact point for families to give them the information that they might need. In lots of cases, as I said, we reached out to families to save them having coming to us so that we could understand their situation. We were really conscious of not creating more noise in a very overwhelming situation. And we undertook what we're calling our Family Experience Project through our program Innovation Lab. And that did some design research which tracked the experience of those families across 6 months during COVID and post-COVID. And we would love the opportunity to share the findings of that. It's a really interesting set of findings from an education perspective, really highlighting the resilience of our families and their increasing understanding of the importance of education through COVID. So we'd love to share that at a future forum if you were open to that. There was lots of concern, next slide, thanks, about finances, as particularly at the beginning. And I think the thing that we were trying to do, families were anxious that their scholarship payments would stop because their children weren't attending school physically. I think that the thing that we were trying to do was to provide reassurance to families and to assure them that they were there for the long term, and then link them into the right information about what support they were eligible for. Next slide. There were some specific issues for our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families. And this comes actually from the Family Experience Project, so health concerns, real fear of the virus, all of the things that you would expect, I suppose, but a really strong focus on disconnection and reconnection to country and family. So during the peak of the lockdown, it was really difficult for families who were unable to visit or support extended family members. And that created huge challenges in a way that we probably don't understand as non-Indigenous people. The loss of connection to country caused a significant amount of stress. And then there was the whole issue of Black Lives Matter and the sort of global and national movement of protests that also impacted and caused additional stress for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families across COVID. Next slide. Thanks, Sophia. There were also some unanticipated consequences. I'm not sure if you caught up with the ANU research, which was done in August 2020, but researchers from ANU took analysis and modelling in August 2020, which looked at the impact on poverty of the COVID-19 JobKeeper and job seeker arrangements. And it took into account the initial JobKeeper and job seeker payments until September, and then the reduced payments from September to March. And in summary, they found that the government's response had reduced measures of poverty and housing stress. It was lower than what would have occurred during the pandemic if the policy changes weren't made, and that poverty and housing stress were lower than prior to COVID-19. So the positive impact on poverty of the measures would be reduced by the changes from September through, although some positive impact does remain, and anticipating dramatic reductions in poverty rates, dramatic increases in poverty rates again once JobSeeker and JobKeeper is suspended post-March. That was August 2020, prior to the current employment data, and ANU are intending to update that research. So it will be interesting to see how that lies. There was also, I think, some research undertaken by Melbourne University that showed that poverty had been almost eliminated in some places where there is very concentrated disadvantage. through job seeker and job keeper payments. And you have to go, how do we end poverty in this country? There might be a bit of a solution there. So I will stop talking now, and I'm happy to take any questions that people would like to ask.
Well, I'll start with one question, Wendy. It's good that you mentioned that challenge now with the changes to the digital world. Want to hear me there? That's okay. Yeah, okay. Obviously, it's made a difference to our outreach and our support of those students in terms of there is a lot more familiarity with the digital world, and it sort of reduces some of those issues of distance. But I'm just wondering what challenges you think there would be for students who are thinking about going to university from there, and how we can deal with some of those digital challenges, as you say.
So I think what we find is that sometimes parents don't understand the importance of digital access for students' education. So, helping parents to understand why it's important that their children have the tools and resources that they need is really key. Understanding that young people who come from disadvantaged backgrounds, or be they rural and remote, or more generally disadvantaged backgrounds, may not have the same rate or elements of digital savviness, if you like, or digital skills as their more advantaged peers. So ensuring that when you're setting them up, that you don't assume that they understand how everything works or how to connect, or indeed that they have the tools that they need to be able to do that. So the sort of onboarding support that you might provide for them. And in some instances, like, we would ensure that any of our tertiary scholarship students, that the scholarship that we provide could be used to provide digital access if needed, or we will provide them directly with a digital access pack if that's what they need to be able to participate. But as I said, Stuart, I don't think that that's a solution. I think we need a system solution. And our advocacy has been around, Wi-Fi and digital access being seen as a utility, in a sense. We've got a couple of arrangements in place. So we've got an arrangement with Optus for a Donate Your Data scheme. So Optus customers with unused data donate now up to, I think it's about 30 gigs a month to our students. Again, it's a patch. It's not a systemic solution, but it does mean that there are businesses and not-for-profit looking at how we can systematize some level of access for those students. So we now have 13,000 students who received that data, and we've just gone out for a second wave, and we've had 11,000 expressions of interest. So that'll be 24,000 students who are getting Donate Your Data through Optus customers.
That's it. I have actually seen that in mine. I'm in Optus. I must donate more now. Third one in Impact it has. That's good. I had one other question, which was about from somebody from Carolina. So what's the mid and long-term forecast for the need for acute support for disadvantaged groups? How are you seeing this developing over time for these disadvantaged groups, and what sort of acute support will they need in the next year?
It's a really big question, and it speaks to some really big policy questions. I think Australia has some real challenges in the way our education system is set up. The residualization of disadvantage in particular schools. We have very place-based concentrated disadvantage, and our school funding systems, I think, mean that notwithstanding the needs funding arrangements now, needs-based funding arrangements, still disadvantaged schools are behind the 8 ball in terms of the resources that they have available to address the concentration of disadvantage in schools. I'm thinking about a primary school that we work with in Wilmot, so Mount Druitt in New South Wales. And I would say that every family in that school is has compound multiple challenges that make it really difficult for their children to attend school. You see spikes in behaviour at school's start time, you know, really challenging behaviours among students that school staff do their very best to manage. But that's the day-to-day reality for schools like that. They need much more in the way of resources and support than they have. They almost need, you know, a case management system for every family that they support. And the system doesn't work well together to support that. Poverty in Australia is not declining. So there are still on the sort of accepted measure of poverty, there are still 1.2 million Australian children growing up in poverty, and that's not reducing. So the link between poverty and educational disadvantage is clear. It's really stark. And my take is that, you know, until we get some better equity into the school funding system and we actually apply the needs-based funding model in the way it was intended, we're not going to see those changes.
Thank you. Were there any more questions if anybody would like to ask now, please?
Wendy, I've got one. I've been reading some of the discussion around this subject in the UK, where I'm thinking of the arguments of Helen Milner that in fact what we should do is see digital literacy actually as a human right, and that's stark a term. I'm just wondering your thoughts. Is that realistic? Do you think it's realistic? And how would you go about achieving that notion of digital literacy as a human right?
Yeah, and we work reasonably closely with Helen. In fact, we've just been introducing the English digital department to Optus because they're interested in that model as a means of sort of supporting digital inclusion. I think the Australian Digital Inclusion Alliance would absolutely take that view, and we're a member of that alliance. I talked about, you know, sort of access to Wi-Fi being seen as almost like a utility that, you know, it's a, if you can't afford it, then it's you're supported to be able to afford it. And I think, you know, full digital access involves obviously sort of the, you know, access to broadband, Wi-Fi. It involves access to the hardware that you need to be able to participate. And it involves being skilled and supported to be skilled in digital literacy. So I would fully concur with Helen's view on that. I think, you know, for us, parents are so key in this. Parents who are not digitally savvy themselves, who you see the mobile phone as their means or vehicle to access services, but that's not a viable solution for their children. We want children to have the option to be creators of technology, not just consumers of technology. So, you know, we would absolutely support that.
Okay, from Veronica there about agreeing with you about the issues of digital literacy and also about the implications for those with other challenges, disabilities, fear, participants and students and so forth as well. So, are there any more questions on the floor? Okay, well, thank you very much, Wendy. That was really, really helpful insight into some of the things that the Smith family does, and obviously we really enjoyed the partnership we've had with you, and we're trying to, as Roberta knows, we're trying to extend that for another couple of years now that we've got better funding guarantees from the government. So hopefully we'll get that sorted out very soon and continue that good work that we've been doing with you. So thank you very much, Wendy.
That's great. I'd like to stay on to hear about the MyTown announcement, if that's okay.
Absolutely, of course, definitely.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm hoping you do. So yes, moving on to the MyTown. This was actually an idea that Carolina Morrison and my team brought to me in the middle of the lockdown last year, and I was a bit skeptical how we're going to make that happen through that period, but I'm really pleased that we did. It's been a very much a student-led project, although it's got great support from both Carolina and Gindri in my team. So Carolina, take it away.
Hello, and thank you so much, Wendy, for your great presentation. And thank you everyone for joining us today. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the elders past, present and emerging. Yes, MyTown, I am very proud and excited to be launching WP's MyTown project, which is the outcome of many months of dedicated work by our students who have been involved, who you'll hear from in a moment, our two SER collaborative colleagues, so Sean and Martin, and also from the WP team. So MyTown was first inspired, as Stuart mentioned, by the fact that we knew that there were many students from regional, rural and remote backgrounds on campus who were looking to connect with other students who had experienced similar journeys to them in participating in learning. At Macquarie, we have around 1,500 students from regional, rural and remote backgrounds, which represents around 11% of our domestic undergraduate cohort. And at a national level, generally there are around about 20% of students that are considered to be of rural, regional and remote backgrounds who are participating in undergraduate study. So as Wendy mentioned, last year, the government, in 2019, it feels like it was last year, the government released the National Rural, Regional and Remote Tertiary Education Strategy paper, and that was in response to the 2018 Independent Review of Regional and Remote Education. One of the key points that was identified as contributing to lower levels of participation in higher education by students from regional, rural and remote backgrounds was the prevalence of thin markets, which are characterised by fewer opportunities. Now, we've long known that regional, rural and remote students face the tyranny of distance regarding access to resources and opportunities, and also including educational opportunities. So while the world in this digital age has seemed to offer a lot more of options, this hasn't necessarily been the case for people living beyond the city limits. So beginning this year and in complement with the new cycle of HEPPP funding, the government has focused its attention on strengthening the capacity of regional communities with education as a key enabling factor. So in response, universities and especially our university will expand the delivery of many existing initiatives, as well as introduce new ones to support students through the life cycle of their learning. So from speaking with our students, our regional and remote students on campus, we know that the decision to leave home and to pursue learning journeys away from families and local communities is not an easy or a light decision to make. And so with that, we wanted to explore via MyTown some of these learning journeys. And so MyTown, as it currently is a media-rich resource in podcast and also short films that celebrates our students from regional and remote backgrounds and their learning journeys. And it celebrates them by empowering them with their personal learning experiences. So they're able to share those through their own narratives. And it's hoped that MyTown will be shared prolifically with audiences to encourage greater awareness of the challenges that are faced by students from regional, remote and rural backgrounds, and also potentially motivate other students to also consider higher education as a pathway that they can pursue. So that's a little bit about MyTown. I'll hand it over to my colleague Gindri to share more about what was actually done and the impact. And then we'll move on to Sean from 2SER, who collaborated with us to create the podcasts, and then from our students who participated in the project, Jessie and Bridie. So thank you.
As Carolina mentioned, MyTown is all about our regional Macquarie students. So we recruited students from across the Macquarie learning community through RMC and the Global Leadership Program. And what resulted was a vibrant collection of 20 student stories representing 12 rural, regional and remote towns across New South Wales. Our MyTown film series was edited and curated by a team of PACE media students and turned into 5 videos which explored 4 central themes. MyTown, where the students tell us all about the towns that they're from, education in their towns, their educational inspirations, and finally their MQ learning journeys. So we were lucky enough to have such a wealth of insight from those interviews that we then created a series of podcasts, which were developed by a team of Macquarie media students, all of whom happened to be regional students themselves. So they were really able to lend a special personal insight into the podcast. 2SER supported the podcast students, and we'll hear from Sean from 2SER as well as our podcast students a bit later. So one of our earliest impacts of MyTown was simply empowering students from regional, rural and remote backgrounds to voice their narratives of navigation through the higher education system, as well as highlighting the unique set of experiences and challenges implicit in regional students' transitions. So the narratives from our students will not only give a face to the existing policy frameworks, but also a voice to the shared experiences of many regional students, which we've heard through our presentations today. So as the Widening Participation Unit, one of our central objectives for MyTown was aimed at instilling confidence and in encouraging other students from regional, remote and rural backgrounds to consider higher education pathways and using role models whose backgrounds and experiences truly echo their own. MyTown also provides an opportunity to connect regional communities with urban audiences and raise awareness to the achievements, aspirations and challenges faced by our regional cohorts. So we're very excited to finally be sharing this project with you, and now I'll hand over to Sean, the Macquarie coordinator of 2SER. Thanks, Sophia.
Thank you very much, Gendry, and thank you very much, Carolina, as well. Yeah, just to explain my background with this project, I'm the Macquarie coordinator for 2SER, the community radio station. For those of you who aren't familiar with 2SER, we are a Sydney-wide station. We're not just the universities, we are actually a Sydney-wide community station based out of here at Macquarie University and also at UTS. And being a community station, we're volunteer run. Given we're at the 2 universities, a lot of the volunteers are students of the 2 universities. So I actually had people involved in this project completely outside of our involvement, prior to our involvement with this podcast, who were already doing some things with 2SER as well as volunteers. 2SER, SER actually stands for Sydney Educational Radio. So obviously one of our key pillars as a station is education. So that was a really important way of getting us involved with this project outside of even the involvement with Macquarie University itself. Generally speaking, when we say education here at the station, we actually have obviously the students coming in and learning roles on radio, producing for radio, presenting for radio, doing various different tasks as we educate them as volunteers. We're teaching them as volunteers what to do. We have involvement with Macquarie University student broadcasts, which is often students' first taste of doing a live media broadcast. So we involve ourselves in the educational programs here at Macquarie University. And we interview a lot of academics. A lot of the content that we produce through the station is through academics and getting sort of an academic voice on a lot of mainstream issues. So that was a lot of the ways we explore education here at the station, but obviously this was exploring education from a different perspective, the perspective of the students, and students in particular, of course, from rural Australian areas. Now, another real core pillar of this for us was the representation of voices that otherwise don't get a lot of representation within the mainstream media. I mean, rural Australia versus kind of the Sydney bubble or the urban bubble that a lot of media is produced within Australia. You know, you're not hearing these voices as much, and when you are hearing them and their experiences as such, they can often be reduced to the level of cliche. They can be reduced to the level of a soundbite or something that already has a kind of familiarity to them already. And rather, we're not really interested in their stories. We're interested in just backing up our understanding of what we already believe when it comes to rural Australia and the experiences of education and the people that are involved in that kind of education. So to us, this was a really tremendous project when Carolina came to me with all the material that they had produced already in the video series and interviewing all of these fantastic rural students that were able to tell their own stories in their own voices. And these were stories of rural environments, first and foremost, aspects of rural environments that we don't necessarily always hear a great deal of, the educational systems within those, and then their experiences entering that bubble that a lot of other people are in and coming to this this education system that obviously I'm already involved with, that 2SER is involved with, that anybody representing Macquarie University is already involved with, this urban education bubble, this tertiary education bubble, coming to it with their perspective based on their experiences and where they'd come from. So I thought that was really valuable to gain some insights from that outsider perspective almost, and from that perspective of rural Australians. Look, we see at the moment, I think it was mentioned a little bit earlier on, you know, the flooding that we've seen over the past week and the enormous damage that has done in some kind of rural areas. I think you can, you know, you see the perspective here in Sydney, and we've had floods, we've had damage, we've had some pretty serious incidences, obviously here within the Sydney region itself. But then you look at the experiences of those in rural areas as opposed to that thing, and you can realise just how serious, just how life and death, just how life altering some of these things can be compared to what we see here in Australia. And that's just obviously just one example of the kind of rural Australian experience that, you know, we're hearing through the media in a sense now when we look for a different perspective on the floods. But when we aren't listening, if we aren't tracking that kind of thing down, if we aren't making a special effort to talk to those people throughout the rest of the year when they're not being affected by disasters, when they're not being affected by major things that also happen to encroach within our space as well, we just don't hear from them if we're not sort of tracking those ones down. So I thought the students in this project, involved in this project, both as producers, the producers who had their kind of own experiences to draw on, and who were involved with talent as well, had unique voices, unique experiences, and it was really tremendous to be able to go back and listen to all those interviews, listen back to all the things that had been produced, and frame that for people, for a new audience, for a podcasting audience and a broadcast audience as well, the 2SER audience. So I thought it was a very valuable experience to actually get those students in their own voices telling their own stories.
Thanks, Sean.
Yeah.
Yes, and so you'll be able to check out all the resources on our Widening Participation website, and also we will be working with Sean to share the podcasts via the 2SER radio network as well. Mm-hmm. But now we will hear from our students. Jessie, if you can please share with us your perspective of participating in the project.
Sure. Also, I apologise if I start cutting out. My internet is not always the best, so I'm sure we'll muddle through. But yes, so my name's Jessie. I'm a second year media and communications student at Macquarie Uni. And I was one of the co-creators of the pod. I wanted to say, as someone who comes from a rural town, it's actually very heartening to know that there are groups of people out there like yourselves who are sort of making it your mission to help communities like mine. I remember in high school, it did feel a bit like we were being forgotten. So thank you. But I started off as one of the interviewees for the video version of MyTown. And it was only through that process of sitting down and sort of telling stories about where I came from that I realized exactly how eccentric and unique an experience it was to come from a rural area. But I mean, having said that, there were definitely times growing up where it didn't seem to be that exciting. So to give you a picture of where I come from, imagine Canberra and then drive an hour and a half away to a town called Braidwood, and then drive another 30 minutes away to a small town called Majors Creek, and then another 5 minutes down a really potholed dirt road in the middle of the bush, and that's sort of my house. So this geographic isolation sort of meant two things. Firstly, we had a really strong community. During the bushfires in the 2020 New Year, Braidwood was trapped between three major bushfires and no one could escape anywhere. So as a result, anyone who had the ability to put a vessel of water on their back of their truck or their ute or whatever, would strapped it to the back of their ute, and they grabbed a pump and a hose and they helped out wherever they could, because there weren't enough fireys in our area to sort of help out there. But secondly, this geographic isolation meant that we had to travel over an hour, sometimes 3, to get to debating competitions, drama competitions, agricultural shows. There was no easily accessible tutors or workshops to sort of further our academic or practical knowledge. So we had a town library and a school library, but they were tiny in comparison to other schools and city libraries. In fact, the only time that I was ever given a textbook was for maths. It had been published in 1996 and had seen several students to their graduation before I'd even checked the book out of the library. So editing the audio for the MyTown podcasts was a really rewarding experience, because I was sort of encountering people who had the same kinds of experiences and had the same values instilled in them. So it made me feel a little bit less alone, particularly considering that I'd just moved to Sydney and I was feeling very out of my depth and sort of navigating a very unfamiliar world of the city, because it's such a culture shock coming from somewhere where like the whole ride to school is paddocks and cows. As a result of this experience, I've sort of become more aware of the importance of the narratives that we hear during our childhood and the role models that we have available to us. Like my family has always been incredibly supportive, so I've never doubted my ability to make it to university one way or another. But I know that there are others in my community who don't have the same support and they don't have anyone to believe in their abilities. So also due to lack of funding and time and resources, rural schools like mine weren't equipped to deal with the extra attention that it would take to get students who fall behind to have the skills or confidence to believe that they can pursue that higher education. Similarly, I think celebrating students who pursue higher education makes it seem more of an achievable goal. At Braidwood, there was a steady stream of strong, confident, intelligent young women who went off to university in the years before me. And going to a kindergarten to year 12 school meant that in primary school, I would watch them deliver speeches and debate in competitions, and then they'd go off to university. But they left a legacy that I felt that I needed to live up to, which I think was really beneficial. But yeah, that's exactly why I decided. I felt that it was an opportunity to contribute to the positive reshaping of attitudes in rural and regional and remote communities. Because although there's several inherent inequalities that divide rural students from city students, it's my belief that even if like one disheartened student hears the stories shared through our podcasts and the videos as well, that they might feel a bit less alone and have more belief in their abilities, sort of bolstered by those who came before them as well. Because I think that's really powerful. If you don't have a role model, you don't know what's possible. So thank you again to the Widening Participation Unit for making this happen.
Thanks, Jessie. And thank you for your contributions and your skills towards this project. So now, Bridie, can you please speak about your experiences?
So I'm Bridie. I'm a student at Macquarie in my 3rd year doing a Bachelor of Media. I was actually approached to help out with the podcasting for the MyTown project by my sister Keely, who was also a collaborator on the team. But what really drew me to do this was when I heard they were seeking students from these like regional, rural and remote areas who had experience and knowledge about being disadvantaged in terms of their education, careers and other opportunities. So this was something that was very close to home for me, and I wanted to be a part of these conversations that were really bringing these issues to light and hopefully make people more aware of the changes that needed to happen in order to give these students a voice and a fair chance with opportunities that aren't hours away. So I was born in Sydney, but I moved with my family when I was about 5 to a relatively small but growing town in regional New South Wales called Tamworth, aka the country music capital of Australia. I've never had a problem living in the country. I actually prefer it. So it's got like these really tight-knit communities where there's a 99% chance you'll bump into someone you know at the shops. Not too many cars in the road, don't have to worry about traffic. Air is a lot cleaner, open space. So all in all, it was a pretty great place to grow up. But what many people, I guess, don't realize is that the quality of education, the careers, and the opportunities within these towns are far less than what you would find in the city. So interestingly, I didn't actually realize to what extent these disadvantages were until I worked on the MyTown podcast and listened through the hours of interviews with other students who had struggled with the same problems that I had struggled with and am still currently experiencing. And as students from the country, we have all the same ambitions as students from these metropolitan areas, but without the resources to achieve it. So I really admire the work that the Widening Participation Unit is doing in encouraging these students to realise their learning potential and just show how much is sacrificed by these rural, regional and remote students to have a quality education. So on my podcast, my specific focus was mainly on early education, where I looked at the schooling systems and what it was like to go to school in the country and what kind of education aspirations these students had. I didn't conduct the interview, so I was kind of a latecomer to the project. So my task just required me to edit and narrate and provide some of my own insights, all done from home in Tamworth. And doing this allowed me to reflect on the others' difficulties in achieving their higher level education to also fulfill their dream careers and how each of us managed to overcome these obstacles differently. Particularly my decision to pursue a career in film and television would never become a reality if I attended my local TAFE or uni, because their courses only really accommodate to a specific country lifestyle and not an alternative career path. And even during school, there were no workshops to learn new skills in my specific field. So it was clear that I had to move to the city, but I think these students really deserve the opportunity to develop their talents in environments that allow them to do so without needing to move halfway across Australia. So I believe it's extremely important to recognise these challenges these students are facing in order to truly celebrate their achievements when they do succeed in a high level education. So it's my hope that by working on this project that unfamiliar audiences will gain a greater appreciation for these students' hard work and recognise that one's location shouldn't determine the quality of their education. So it's an important issue that I'm glad the Widening participation is discussing and empowering these students to offer their personal learning journeys. And I feel fortunate that I was given the chance to contribute to these conversations, and with the hope that we might see some change in the future.
Thanks so much, Bridie. That's very inspirational to hear. And yes, as I mentioned, if anyone is interested in looking at the website, I think that we'll have a picture up of the website, but you can see all the resources that have gone into it. You can click on the podcast tab, and that will take you to all the podcasts that have been produced by our students, and with the help of 2SER, Sean, the films. So there are 5 short films there, and we've also got a little tab on the impact that the program has so far had, and credits. You'll be able to see everyone who participated in this. So please take a look, and we hope to be able to share this resource quite widely with various audiences. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Carolina, Gindri, Bridie and Jessie. That's fantastic. Thanks to all of you and all the hard work you've put in over the last few months on this as well. That's been really excellent. I do have a question for Jessie and Bridie. Obviously, there's been a lot of changes in the last year, COVID's impact on us all. I'm just wondering how that has affected your ability to study. I think Bridie, you're still based up in Tamworth, so just wondering how that's affected you, or if you know anybody that's studying in school, say there, or uni, how's that affected the ability to study at the moment?
Well, I actually had to move back down to Sydney because I am doing quite a practical course. So I'm doing radio and film and television. So I have to use the studios. But last year was particularly challenging with doing that course in particular because I was in second year and now I'm in third year, and I'm only now just going into the studio and doing all these, like, making movies and things, which I kind of don't really know how to do yet because it was something I should have learnt a year ago. So we just had to I guess, work with what we had at home. So we had to, instead of using all the proper equipment and the microphones and the cameras, I would just have to make movies with my iPhone and do interviews with my phone. So that was quite a challenge to do all of that. And yeah, especially because I was away, Tamworth is about 6 hours away from Sydney. When there were instances where we did actually have to meet up to do a film, for example, I would have to drive down to Sydney and for a week and book somewhere and try and get that done. So it was quite a challenging year, but I was fortunate that I had, I guess, a good support system at home, people that encouraged me, teachers that really made sure their students were accommodated to. And yeah, but definitely this year it's a lot better being in Sydney to do my course. But yeah.
Thank you. And Jessie?
I agree. I'm doing a film and television focused degree as well. So I was always a drama kid in high school, and I sort of had my heart set on doing a degree that was quite practical. I just had really bad timing, apparently. So I moved the 3.5, or actually it's probably more like 4.5 hours from where I lived with my parents up to Sydney, on like the intention of being able to sort of be near a group of people who were like-minded and wanted to make films outside of class, and sort of have access to all those opportunities. So I made quite a few sacrifices, and I saved up for a long while, and then I spent all of that sort of paying my bond and paying the first 3 months of rent, or having that there, only to realize that I didn't actually need to be up here because they'd converted everything to online. So that was quite frustrating to go for that long preparing and then sort of have that happen. But I mean, it's not really just COVID, as you've all been talking about, it's the floods as well. And it was the fires, basically what is now a year ago. I think all of that, like, I don't get any support from my parents in terms of money because they just can't afford to. We couldn't afford before all the fires and COVID and the floods and everything. So I'm relying on HECS debt. But on top of all of those sort of issues, it's compounding to the point where I'm almost supporting my parents. So there's quite a lot of dynamic changes, I think, that the floods and the fires and COVID has caused. It's definitely not been a convenient change.
No, I don't think it is for many of us. That's true. And just before we finish this, Sean Britton, I think that there may be some opportunities for this to be rolled out a bit more widely, some of these podcasts. Is that right?
Yeah, well, that's our intention. Certainly, we've got the podcast now on all the kind of regular podcast services you can imagine, so people can kind of track that one down. We're going to be broadcasting it on the Tuesday daily program at 2SER, so we're always going to put on one of our daily programs. So from next week, we'll be broadcasting it once a week for 6 weeks to kind of drive some more people towards the podcast, and hoping to get it out there. Well, we'll certainly put it out there on the Community Radio Network, which is a network of community stations that goes all around Australia, many of which are in rural areas because they're kind of the primary media service that actually services those areas when none others will. We'll be putting that out there as well, and they can basically pick that up and play them as desired. When it's out there with the Community Radio Network, they just pick it out of the archive, such as it were, and play them on their stations for broadcast.
Fantastic. Oh, that's good. That's great that you can get that content out there, and the more we can share it, the more the work all the students put into it, and yourself and Caroline, that's going to be
absolutely
value into that. Thank you so much to all of you. We better move on to the last speaker today, last but not least. So Peter Davis is the Dean of Robert Menzies College and has been since 2017. Robert Menzies College is a great partner for Widening Participation. We do quite a lot with them in terms of refugee students, but also work that we have with regional rural students as well. So Peter, do you want to tell us about supporting students?
So thank you, Stuart, for the invitation. And like others, I too acknowledge the traditional custodians of our land and pay respect to elders past, present and future. I said that I would actually navigate my own slides, but Sophia, I don't know if you're able to do that for us.
I'm sure we can organise it. Just give us a few seconds.
Wonderful. Yeah, I'll just get you to step through. So, this is actually my 4th year as Master of Robert Menzies College. Bit about the history of RMC. So I'll just move to the next slide. So our vision statement is forming the person, transforming our world. And I'll talk a little bit about how we do that later in the presentation. We opened in 1973, so early in Macquarie University's history. We initially opened with 200 rooms, and then we added another 100 rooms in 2012. And we're an Anglican college affiliated with the university. Our team at RMC includes 2 deans. So one of our deans, Dr. Katrina Clifford, is here for this particular presentation today as well. We have a counsellor who works with us, a chaplain. Currently, we've got 9 residential advisors. We normally would have 13 in a normal year, plus a whole host of professional staff. I wanted to talk about how. If we go back up the top, we should be on slide 3. Yep. So there's a picture of Sir Robert Menzies. And the college, of course, is named after Sir Robert Menzies. He was Australia's longest serving Prime Minister. He's also a polarising figure, so it doesn't matter who you talk to, you certainly get a strong response. But the college was named after Robert Menzies because of his service in the area of university education. In many ways, he was a person who was instrumental in opening wide the opportunity for university education to students. And the quote that I've got there comes from his parliamentary speech in 1957 when he was responding to the Murray Report. He said then, it's not yet adequately understood that a university education is not, and certainly should not be, the prerequisite of a privileged few. We must, on a broad basis, become a more and more educated democracy if we are going to raise our spiritual, intellectual, and material living standards. I share that for a couple of reasons. One is that it was extremely important to him that university education not be the prerequisite of a privileged few, but also that there is a holistic dimension to it. That in terms of our experience of the benefits of higher education, it impacts us in a variety of different ways. It impacts us spiritually, intellectually, and materially. So the college was named after him. Some of the distinctives about RMC. RMC has a distinct caregiver identity. I mean, some colleges focus on the scholarly aspects and so forth. That's important to us, but probably the key attribute is our caregiver identity. It's a place where people are provided with a supportive environment as they transition from home to independent adult life. And we provide support for people from all sorts of backgrounds and situations. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute or two. So some of the things that are important to us is the sense of community, that the college environment is an easy place for people to make friends if they get involved in the life of the community. It's a place that people regard as home. And it's a supportive environment. So it's more than just a place to live. It's a way of life that impacts and shapes people. Safety and security are really important to us. So it's a safe place where students can take risks and explore boundaries. And we have a good team of residential families and residential advisors that support people in that process. We're often described as a dry college, which is we're probably one of a small number of colleges in Australia that are like that. That doesn't mean that we're wowsers, we're not. We just want the college to be a safe place for everybody. And so we tend to get people who are drawn to the college for that reason. They come for a specific purpose, and they want to concentrate on their studies rather than be distracted by unwanted disruptions or have their lives impacted by irresponsible behaviours. Academic excellence is also important to us. So we provide free academic tutoring in most disciplines, and the college is a quiet environment where people can concentrate on their studies. Formation in the sense of holistic development is really important to us. And so in 2020, we started what we called the RMC Leadership Certificate. This is a non-accredited certificate that students can participate in if they want to. It's not compulsory. There is no cost, but what they learn from that is intended to supplement the learning in their degrees. And so we help people in this to focus in 4 areas: spiritual and relational development. The second one is vocational development. In other words, developing that sense of calling to a particular vocation. The third area is helping people develop ethical frameworks. And then the final area is a focus on resilience and self-care. So that's a particular focus of Katrina's work as our Dean of Academics. Spiritual life is important to us as a college. So we're a Christian college, of course. So we're very open about faith, but we don't force faith on anybody. We have people from all major religions and people with no religious background. and we encourage everybody to speak openly about the things that they believe in, and to do so in a respectful way. I think one of the things about university colleges, which is often not recognised, but I think is important, is that they actually do provide good value for money. So you don't have to enter into a 12-month lease. Everything is provided. You enter into a 38-week contract, and it actually takes a lot of the stress out of moving to city to study for people. So as I said, basically the sense of community means that people regard this as their home, and in that sense, it's a very nurturing place. A little bit on the demographics. So the next slide. We would normally have a 50-50 split between domestic students and international students. That would be in a normal year. This is not a normal year. So currently we'd be about 60% domestic and 40% international. People in the college come from roughly 40 different countries. So there's a really good cultural mix there. And gender-wise, be 50% female, 50% male. So there's a good balance there. In terms of where people come from, 6% of our residents come from the Greater Sydney area. 41% come from regional New South Wales. 12% are from interstate, and the other 41% are overseas students. So there's very much a mixture of backgrounds for all our residents. What I would probably like to do in the next few minutes is just talk about how we focus on 4 particular groups. And the first one is residents from regional New South Wales. So as I said, we have traditionally drawn a large number of our students from regional New South Wales. The benefit of what we do here is that exposes people to all sorts of different experiences, and so they'll go home having seen a whole array of things, or learned a whole array of things, or met people, and that has a significant impact upon their lives. There are a lot of community and cultural experiences that go on in college life. So we have an international night once a year. This year's will be next Monday. We have an arts week, and then there's all sorts of interactions that take place in our blocks. So the idea of the college is really a place where people can expand their minds and to be exposed to all sorts of different ideas and experiences and people, and that's certainly the case here. So for people who come from a regional or a remote area, it could well be the case that you're the only person from your town who's come to Sydney to study, and there may not be many people back home who understand what you're experiencing when you're in an environment where you're in a university with 40,000 people. But this gives us a place where people can navigate those changes. It's a safe landing place. So people come from a small community, and they then move into a small community where they can be nurtured, and it opens them up to a wide range of opportunities, whether that be in the workplace area, or whether it be through the people that they meet, who may come from other states or people from other countries. We also have a number of Indigenous students, some who come from very remote areas. I'll talk about that in a minute. And obviously, coming to Sydney to settle into studies here is a really stressful thing for them, and they're facing challenges that other students frequently do not face. So that's the way in which we seek to support and help students from regional New South Wales. A few other things that we're involved in. We have, so next slide. We have a partnership with the Wagga Study Hub and a close connection with Wallangamaroo. So there's a picture of our current cohort taken a month or two ago. So since 2019, RMC has provided accommodations for students from the Wagga Study Hub. The bulk of these students come from southeast Arnhem Land, so they come from very remote communities. And some of these students have attended high school for a period in Darwin or Brisbane. The cultural adjustment of studying in Sydney is very significant and requires slow and patient work by everybody who is involved. So the team effort with Wollongongo, the study hub, colleges such as ours, and the university more generally is crucial in that regard. A third area that we're involved in, next slide, is a joint scholarship that we have with Widening Participation. So we've been doing this since 2020. So that's a joint scholarship focused on students from refugee or asylum seeker backgrounds. As we're aware, nothing normal at all happened in 2020. So it's very hard for us to assess the effectiveness of the program after just that 1 year. But this year we now have 2 students who are participating in that, so it's expanded to 2 students, and certainly those students are integrating well into the life of the community and appear to be doing well in their studies. And then the fourth and final thing that I wanted to focus on is we've been working with Study New South Wales in providing accommodation as part of their temporary crisis accommodation scheme. So there have been a number of places across New South Wales that have done that. So these students have really had their learning experience disrupted because they lost their jobs as soon as COVID hit. Family businesses back home went into lockdown, or investments were impacted severely, and they used up all their savings very early in the piece. So we've had 55 students who've participated in that program. Many of them have had various degrees of trauma, things that have happened to them personally, things that have happened to family back home. In at least in 2 students' cases, both those students had their entire families who were diagnosed with COVID. And in many cases, the students themselves are not just trying to cover their own tuition costs here, but they too are trying to financially support families back at home who are unable to support themselves. And so, yeah, so we've been really focusing in those 4 areas. As we said, RMC was named after Sir Robert Menzies and his vision of university being a place not just for the privileged few. And so what we've been seeking to do is really focus in those 4 areas, focusing in students from regional New South Wales, trying to help and assist remote Indigenous students through the Wagga Study Hub, students from asylum seeker and refugee backgrounds, plus also stranded international students. So at that point, I might leave it there and hand back to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. That's really good. As you say, I think the work we're doing with the the refugee students has been really important for those students, as Lotus says. Can that link that you posted up there, if you send that to us, we'll send it out to everyone who's on here so that they can access that as well.
Yeah, I'll put that there. Let me just explain. That link is just an interview that we did probably about 6 weeks ago, and we sent out to our alumni and friends. It's actually a fundraising thing. I didn't put it there for that reason, but you'll get a feel for how the experience has impacted the life of one student. So, but I'll put that up for you.
Yeah, and it's interesting you touched on. I mean, it's not really relevant, particularly to some of our talking now, but for the international students, you say it's been some of them are stranded here. I just wondered if you just speak about that for a second.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, well, I think for many of the students, I mean, obviously, COVID totally changed their world. They came out here to pursue a dream, and very suddenly everything changed. Generally, they had a plan in place. Families were financially backing them. The idea would be that they would find work and support themselves financially. But basically, they lost all avenues of support. So, for many of those students, they were at great risk of homelessness. And so I think just being able to provide accommodation for them, that was for a period of up to 20 weeks. So the government paid us a small amount of money, which meant that we could provide them with free accommodation for that 20-week period. In essence, I think what that did was enable them just to have a quiet space where they could focus on their studies rather than being consumed by anxiety and worry. And just provided a stable framework just for that period of time while they saved up money and worked out what they were going to do as their next step.
That's very interesting. Yeah, I know it's been very challenging for many. But thank you very much, Peter, and for all our presenters. As I said in the chat, we're hoping to have this later in the year, have another of these forums. We'd really appreciate any suggestions from anybody in terms of topics that would be great to cover. Although we have our own ideas of what we might want, any other speakers you might think of as well, we're always open to that. We would like to have something on campus, but I definitely want to make sure that we keep the Zoom option out there, because I think it's really good to have, it gives a lot more opportunity to others to join in who might not be able to make it onto campus for various reasons. So thank you all so much. Many of you work with us, and so thank you for that. And I think we'll leave it there. Thank you.
If I can just have one final word, I will share a survey link with everybody, and you can pop in your recommendations for the next forum as well in that survey. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, bye.